The purpose of today's lesson is to do a recap on what we've read and what we know about the characters so far. Ben Ross. He's a young, popular history teacher, and Ross really wants to engage with these learners, and he doesn't want to just throw facts at them. So when the time comes to study the Holocaust, Ross struggles to come up with a way to explain the atrocities of the Nazis, specifically how many Germans could sit by and allow the atrocities to happen. When Ross finds himself unable to answer students' question as to why ordinary Germans would put up with or even participate or turn a blind eye to what the Nazis did, he gets the idea for an exercise that will show his students how easy it is to get swept up in groupthink. Laurie Saunders. Laurie Saunders is the protagonist of the novel. Right, she's described as an intrepid and bright-eyed high schooler, and she's the editor-in-chief of her school paper, The Gordon Grapevine. Laurie is sunny but thoughtful, and she takes her editorial duties and her studies very seriously. She's popular and well-liked, but she does have anxiety specifically about her relationship with her boyfriend, who's described as self-centered, and her friendship with the overly competitive Amy. When her history teacher Ben Ross shows Laurie and her class a documentary about the Holocaust, Laurie is deeply emotionally affected by the footage of the concentration camps. And she starts to ask the questions about how ordinary people could commit such terrible atrocities, or merely just stand by and watch as they occur. David Collins, Laurie Saunders' boyfriend. He's described as a tall, good-looking running back on the Gordon High football team. He's athletic, he's popular, he's bright, and he's obviously a bit more than self-centered. He has trouble feeling empathy for other people, and he struggles to focus on issues that don't affect him personally. After seeing the Holocaust film in Ben Ross's class, he isn't nearly as affected as Laurie is, and he tells her that he sees the events of World War II as a piece of history that can't be changed or repeated, so therefore it doesn't affect us in present day. Amy Smith. This is Laurie's best friend. She's described as fun and free-spirited, right, with a bit of a rebellious streak. Petite and pretty, Amy is nonetheless insecure about how she measures up to Laurie. And she's desperate to emulate her more popular friend. So there's a massive amount of competitiveness amongst her and Laurie, and it's this competition that actually keeps them from being good friends. Robert Billings, is described or regarded as the creepy guy in the class, has a typical stereotype of being the loser or the class loser amongst the seniors at Gordon High. He's painfully introverted, right? He grows up in the shadow of his successful older brother, who was a popular Gordon alumni. Brian Ammon. Brian is David's best friend and a quarterback on the football team. In spite of his popularity, he isn't doing well academically at the school. Carl Block. Along with Alex Cooper, Carl's one of the biggest practical jokers at Gordon High. He's described as tall and lanky with blonde hair. Carl is an investigative reporter for the Grapevine. He is skeptical of the wave from the start. And Brad, also a student at Gordon High who takes special pleasure in tormenting Robert Billings. Principal Owens, he's described as imposing. Alright, he's large, towering over many, who frequently smokes a pipe and is never seen in anything less than a three-piece suit. Owens, who is usually open to new ideas and experiments in furthering his students' education, is initially skeptical of the wave when Ben Ross brings this idea to him. But Owens has faith in Ross as an educator, and even admires Ross's goal of teaching his students an important moral lesson. Norm Schiller. Norm Schiller is the Gordon High football coach. He takes his students' success on the field, or lack thereof, deeply personally. We know from the beginning that his team hasn't been doing well at all. And he's excited when the wave seems to be shaping his players up into a more cohesive, powerful team. Mrs. Saunders. Mrs. Saunders is Laurie's mother. Okay, described as perceptive or a worrywart. Okay, is always overly concerned and overly involved in Laurie's friendships, problems, and what happens at school. Laurie finds her mother annoying at the start of the novel, but as the wave takes over the school, Laurie begins confiding in her mother about how scary things are becoming. Alright, we're going to have a quick look at chapters 1 to 7. Okay, we've all now read up until 6, so we'll also have a look at 7 as well. Chapter 1, Laurie Saunders is sitting by herself in the publication office, right of the school's newspaper. She's alone and quite irritated. She's been with the paper for the past 3 years, and the paper has never once come out on time. Even as the editor, she hasn't been able to change the pattern. She leaves the office. There are a few minutes left in this period, and she walks over to Mr. Gobondi's extremely boring French class. So this is in quite a massive contrast to Mr. Ross's history class later on. She looks in the window and starts making faces at her best friend, Amy Smith. Okay, Ben Ross is an history teacher. Okay, we learn that he's quite terrible at using technology, and he tries to set up the film projector so he can show his history class a film. Right, so remember, when this novel was set, there weren't projectors or what we know today, or DVDs, so quite a lot different technology to what we use today. When the bell rings and the students come in, Ben asks David Collins to set the projector up for him, and David is Laurie's boyfriend and the captain of the football team, as we discussed earlier. In chapter 2, the massive topic of World War II and the Holocaust is discussed in Ben Ross's history class, and the movie is showing is about the Nazi concentration camps. The students stare at the men and women shown in the film. These people are literally starving to death, and they are pure skin and bones. Ben's already seen this film, but it still is hideous to him. Most of the students don't seem affected by this film, and Laurie Saunders, though it looks like she's been crying, and Amy Smith also seems to be bothered by the film. Amy asks Ben if all German people were Nazis, and the answer, far from it. It turns out that only about 10% of Germans were actually Nazis. Amy asks why the rest of the Germans didn't stop the Nazis from murdering the Jewish population. This is a tough question, and Ben isn't sure how to answer this. He says that after World War II, many German people said they didn't know what Hitler was doing, and some people in the class think it's impossible that the German people didn't know what was going on. Ben responds. He says the Nazis were highly organized and feared. The behavior of the rest of the German population is a mystery. Why they didn't try to stop it, and how they could say they didn't know. Chapter 3. David Collins has already finished his lunch when Laurie Saunders gets to the cafeteria. When Laurie sits down, they watch Robert Billings. He sits at a table, and the two girls who are already sitting there get up and leave. David thinks Robert acts the way he does because of the way people treat him. Laurie adds her 2 cents. She says that her mom knows Robert's mom. Apparently, Robert has been tested, and there's no real reason why he does bad in school. There isn't anything wrong with his brain. Having done their share of people watching, Laurie brings up the film from the class. David says it bothers him, sure, but that it's not something that they can do anything about. It's just part of history. Laurie agrees, but doesn't think they can just forget about it either. Soon Amy Smith and Brian Ammon show up. The topic of the film comes up again, and Amy says she's shaken up by it too. Laurie says she's leaving to go work on the Gordon Grapevine. Amy isn't part of the newspaper staff, but she decides to hang out in the publication office with Laurie. Though she doesn't say it out loud, Laurie feels like Amy is always competing with her. Ever since Laurie started dating David, Amy decided she had to date a football player too. And it doesn't end there. She's competitive about grades and popularity as well. Right, so typical high school drama. Soon enough, 2 of the other members of the Grapevine staff show up. Carl Block, the investigative reporter, and Alex Cooper, the music reviewer. Laurie then asks them where their articles are, and they both say that they have a plane to catch, and then, in a truly mature fashion, they run away. Chapter 4, Ben Ross is troubled. He feels bad that he couldn't give his students answers to their questions about the Nazis and the German people in his history class. So he stops by the library on his way home and picks up a bunch of books on the topic. The more you know, the more you can teach, right? Ben's wife, Christy, played tennis with a friend tonight, so Ben spends hours reading. None of the books seem to have the answers he's looking for. Right, he thinks about it. Maybe the only way Ben's students would understand is if they were somehow in a similar situation. Ben kind of likes this idea. Maybe he can spend a few class periods trying to give his students a sampling or a taste of what life in Nazi Germany might have been like. After tennis, Christy had dinner with a friend, so she doesn't get home until around 11 o'clock. Even that late, she finds Ben still buried in his books. She knows Ben gets really obsessed with whatever he's working on, and she asks what the latest project is. He's too distracted to answer, so she looks at some of his books. When she sees the titles, she humorously asks, "What are you doing? Cramming for a degree in dictatorship?" He explains that his students asked him some important questions that he wasn't able to answer. But it turns out that none of the books he has seem to have the answer either. The students might only be able to understand through experience, he tells his wife. It seems like business as usual in Ben Ross's history class at the start of chapter 5, but then the students notice what is written on the blackboard: strength through discipline. Ben explains that today's class will be about discipline. This doesn't make them very happy, to say the least. They thought that Mr. Ross was way better than to lecture them about stuff like this. What you're really going to talk about is that of power and success. Discipline, he says, is the way to get power and success. First, he uses football as an example. Turning to the football players in the room, he points out that in order to be successful at football, the players have to have discipline, right? One player points out that they have had a 2-year losing streak, which isn't too great. Next, Ben uses ballet dancing as an example, turning to the ballerina in the class, and she agrees that she has to be disciplined to succeed in ballet. Ben tells the students that any art requires discipline. And now he says he can show them how to create power through discipline. And to his surprise, his students look interested. Ben says it all starts with posture. He has Amy sit up very stiff and straight to show what a disciplined posture looks like. The other students follow suit, even Robert. Ben tells the class to follow Robert's example, and they do. Next, Ben has the class practice getting up from their chairs, lining up, then getting back to their seats. They practice until they are able to do this in a super fast, organized way. So discipline. After this exercise, Ben is amazed at how quiet the class is. They are excited and ready for more. He says there are 3 other rules they need to follow in order to achieve power and success through discipline. The first being, everybody has to have a pencil and paper and take notes. Second, stand next to your desk whenever you answer a question. Third, when you answer a question, you have to say Mr. Ross before your answer. The class seems to agree with the rules. Ben starts firing questions at the students about history from the textbook readings. The students answer really quickly, following Ben's new rules. The bell rings, but nobody moves, creating quite an eerie tone. Ben gives them reading homework and finally dismisses them. The class rises together and leaves the classroom. In the hall, Brian, Eric, Amy, and David talk about what happened. They think it was pretty amazing. Brad says it was no big thing, just a different way of doing what they always do, answering questions. David thinks there's something more to it than that. He leaves the group and goes to the bathroom. In the store, he wonders if Brad is right. No, he doesn't think so. The class was so excited. If he could somehow get the football team as organized and excited as the class was today, maybe they could win a game at least. He leaves the store, but he stops when he notices someone standing by the sink. It's Robert. He's looking in the mirror. David watches as Robert straightens his posture and makes motions with his mouth, like he's still in Mr. Ross's class today, answering questions. That night, Ben tells his wife about what happened in class, and she can't believe the class stayed after the bell rang. She asks if he will keep on with the experiment, but he says he isn't sure. He needs to talk to the class about the other aspect of World War II, the war with Japan. He doesn't tell Christy, but he was just as caught up in what happened today as his students were. He really liked the way these kids were able to answer so many questions so rapidly. It was kind of amazing. The next day, there's a major first. Ben is late to class. But when he gets there, all the students are already in class, sitting quietly and stiffly at their desks with their new posture. When he realizes this isn't some kind of joke, he decides to continue with his experiment. He goes to the board and writes the word community under the words strength through discipline. He explains that community is a bond that holds together a group of people who are working towards the same goal. It's the feeling you get when you work together with others for something that is bigger than you, any individual. In chapter 6, continued, David totally gets what he's talking about and thinks it could be really useful for the football team. Ben continues, community, like discipline, is something they'll have to experience to understand. Okay, so now they have two mottos, strength through discipline and strength through community. The students each get up, stand by their desks, and recite the mottos. Laurie and Brad look uncomfortable, but they do join in. The next step, Ben says they need a slogan for their community. He draws a wave on the blackboard. Their movement will be called The Wave. He says they will also have a salute. He forms his hand into the shape of a wave and then puts it against his left shoulder. Okay, so this is quite similar to what the Nazis did. The students practice the salute until they get it right. Ben says that whenever they see another member of the wave, they should give the salute. Now Ben asks each member of the class to give the salute and say the motto. After school that day, David tells Eric about his plan to use ideas from the wave to improve the football team. Eric is skeptical. He isn't sure that they should even tell anyone outside the classroom about the wave. Then Brian gets in on the conversation. He says that he would just about do anything to be more successful in football. A guy named Deutsch, who wants to steal Brian's position on the team, starts teasing Brian. Things escalate quickly, and all of a sudden Brian and him are about to get into a fist fight. David gets in between them and says that this is why they can't win. They don't act like a team. Instead, they're just a bunch of individual guys, each out for himself. David starts telling them about the mottos and showing them the salute. In chapter 7, so that night, Laurie Saunders tells her parents what's been going on in her history class for the last 2 days. Miss Saunders isn't psyched. Okay, it's all too militaristic for her. But Laurie doesn't think it's a bad thing. So far it's been a good experience. It's actually been bringing her classmates together. According to Mr. Saunders, anything that will help students pay attention can't be bad. Laurie continues to share her thoughts, and she brings up Robert Billings. How can the wave be bad if it stopped kids from picking on him? History class, says Mr. Saunders, should be about learning history, not learning about to be a part of a group. Things are starting to heat up. To counter his wife's argument, Mr. Saunders says that learning about working together as a team or a group is how America was made. Groups like the Pilgrims had to cooperate and act towards a common goal. Community is indeed important, Mr. Saunders admits. But America is also about people being independent and thinking for yourself. This is what she wants for Laurie. Once again, Laurie tries to defend the wave, but her mother just isn't having it. Her father supports her, saying that Ben Ross probably knows exactly what he's doing, and Miss Saunders shouldn't worry about it. To Mrs. Saunders, it sounds like Ben is manipulating his students. Laurie assures her this isn't the case. They really seem to like being told exactly what to do. Christy understands this. It's definitely easier to do what you are told than to think for yourself. But something about the wave really bugs Christy. For one thing, Ben is acting like the students in his history class are now better than the other students or something. She asks Ben how far he is going to go with his experiment, and he's not sure, but is really curious to see what will happen if and when he continues with it. Mr. Saunders changes the subject by asking where Laurie's boyfriend David is tonight. He comes over almost every night to study with Laurie and to talk to her dad about sports and engineering. Turns out David wants to be an engineer, like Laurie's dad. Laurie tells him that David decided to stay at home and study for history tonight. The wave can't be too horrible if David is studying. Cut to the home of Ben and Christy Ross. Ben is telling Christy that so far the experiment seems to be turning his class into better students, and probably better people.